You're listening to WLPN 105.5 FM Chicago, and you're listening to Labor Express Radio, Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. News for working people by working people. I'm your host, Jerry Medalacero, and this is the Sunday, June 24th, 2018 edition of Labor Express. Here on Labor Express, we understand that immigrants' rights are workers' rights and vice versa. It is impossible to defend workers' rights organized in advance of a working-class agenda, while a major component of the working class, immigrants, fear for the most basic security for their very lives and that of their families. Just as an advance of organized labor in our country in the 19th century absolutely required the abolition of slavery, so too in the 21st century the improvement of the lives of all working people requires securing the right for workers to migrate to counterbalance the power of capital. That is why we spent considerable time on this program covering issues facing immigrants. So the current crisis on our southern border, in which the Trump administration is bringing back some of the darkest periods of our nation's past history and taking immigrant children away from their parents, demands that we hear from our friends in the immigrants' rights movement about what we must do to fight the administration's actions. As wonderful as it has been to see the mainstream media spending considerable time covering the current crisis, they rarely offer space for the voices of migrants themselves. So I reached out to a longtime friend of Labor Express Radio, Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianza Americas. Alianza Americas is a network of Latin American and Caribbean immigrant organizations in the United States. It is the only national organization in the U.S. that is rooted in the Latino immigrant communities and works both domestically and transnationally to create an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way of life. Tonight's program will be devoted entirely to my interview with Oscar about the current situation. We're going to skip our international labor news update from Radio Labor this week so we have full time to air this interview in its entirety. Oscar covers a lot of ground in this interview, which I conducted via phone last Wednesday, just as Trump was signing an executive order that was allegedly meant to end the family separation policy. Oscar talks about the global rise of xenophobia and the increase in migration as both the result of an increasing crisis of neoliberal economics and politics. We talk about the roots of the current flow of migrants from Central America and how the right wing has utilized this movement of desperate people to mobilize working class support by appealing to nationalism and racism. And we talked about how we can fight back against this agenda. I started my conversation with Oscar asking him to provide a brief overview of the current crisis and the Trump administration's policy of separating families at the border.
Well, essentially what's been happening is that going back roughly 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration announced something in a very formal manner, something they had already been doing for the past several months, and it is essentially what they call a zero-tolerance policy at the U.S. southern border. And under that particular initiative, what they have been doing is essentially detaining families that are traveling together with their children and separating the children from the parents. And they are essentially doing that as a way of further communicating to potential migrants going northward, from Central America, that they will be divided and that their children could well end up separated for good, from their parents. I mean, that is the fear factor that they are using as a deterrent, in addition to everything else that they had already been trying before. This administration has gone to the extreme of basically using that particular fear factor as a way of conveying to people, don't dare to come because we will keep you away from your kids and you may not even get to see your kids again. That's the real intent, behind what's been happening. And of course, this crisis, as I said, didn't really begin 2 weeks ago. It began several months ago. But it has reached, just over the last week, a boiling point simply because one single recording that was actually done while kids were in a detention facility, where you can clearly see the kind of psychological trauma that these kids are being subjected to. And the fact that this became public knowledge is what has caused this huge outputting of basically opposition, to put it nicely, to this particular initiative by the Trump administration. And I guess that the last thing I would say is that while this is repugnant, this is something absolutely that makes you want to throw up what they've been doing. it is really not something so new. It is something that has been brewing gradually over the past several years. In many ways, the forces that were unleashed back in 2014, by then President Obama, calling what was happening in the U.S. southern border a crisis, it's related to this set of steps, that have taken us to where we are today. And if you want to take an even longer view, this is the logical result of a sustained, relentless campaign to essentially demonize, dehumanize the image of the immigrant of today as some sort of threat, some sort of trouble that we need to prevent being attacked from. And so, again, this is what we see essentially as the ultimate escalation in this particular steady, relentless campaign that has now been around for at least 2.5 decades.
Right. You really touched on several things that I want to expand upon in this interview. Sure. Before we kind of move on to some of those points, though, just again to kind of recap a little bit. So this current policy of separating the children from their parents, the way that the administration has been justifying it, they're trying to say that this is a problem. The president himself has really tried to play this on the Democrats, saying it's something to do with the immigration law that requires this. That is, of course, completely false. What they're pointing to is this 1997 Flores consent decree, which is, if you look into the history of that, it's fascinating because it actually goes back to a case in the 80s in which this Jenny Lisette Flores, who was a 15-year-old, was in detention for an extended period of time. She was being strip searched daily, all kinds of abuse, and as a result of her case, there was it basically kind of weaved its way through the courts for decades, resulted in 1987 in this consent decree that it's very complicated, but basically started a policy by which children wouldn't be kept in detention for more than 21 days. But the way that's been dealt with in the past is that then if there were children involved, they were released to the custody of their parents who were, if they were in legal proceedings, they were allowed to live in the community during the time that those proceedings were happening. What's going on now is because the administration wants to crack down on all people entering the country, whether they're seeking asylum or whatever the case is, this no tolerance policy that it's requiring them to jail every single one of these parents that comes into the country as if they're criminals, and as a result, that means that they're separating the children from their family. So it's not at all something that's in the law. It's a policy that the administration is pursuing, and they're trying to use this kind of bizarre policy that's in place with this consent decree, which goes back to, I remember back in the mid-2000s, there was this increasing use of family detentions where they were holding whole families in detention, and there was a bit of a scandal around that. I remember one of our kind of common friends, Carrie Lighterson, did some journalism work around that, and there was a bit of outcry about that, so they moved away from these holding families in detention. But this idea of separating kids from their families and that's necessary under the law is completely false.
Absolutely. No, it is correct. And I think that this administration, because of the clarity of purpose that is clearly driving them from day one, when they came into the White House, they have no hesitation whatsoever to interpret existing law in the most narrow, strict of ways, and actually use whatever existing law there is to essentially justify the application of such laws and such even legal agreements, like the Flores agreement, for example, in a way that is practically redefined, and it is used to advance, again, a very clear purpose. And it's important to understand that when this administration comes into office, from an immigration and immigrants perspective, they basically have two clear goals in mind. One is make as difficult as possible for anybody to come into this country that shouldn't be here. That includes, of course, people trying to enter the U.S. without inspection, mainly through airports, when they basically get inspected, but the intention for many of these people coming in is to stay. But more commonly, people coming through the southern border. And that's definitely goal one that they have stuck very faithfully to. And goal number two is remove, expel from the country everybody who shouldn't be here. And that's not limited to people without visas. That includes people who have visas and even people who have become naturalized U.S. citizens, but that in the view of this administration may have actually violated the law when they apply for U.S. citizenship. So essentially, all foreign nationals who they deemed as undesirable is definitely in the target of this administration to advance, as I said, to clear objectives, and that's what in my mind, clearly makes understandable, not at all acceptable, but understandable why they are going about everything the way they are. Because as I said, they can be anything you want except purposeless. They clearly have a purpose, and the purpose is driven by these two objectives that I just mentioned when it comes to specifically how to relate to immigration policy and how to relate to people who are already present in the U.S.
You mentioned, too, that what kind of turned things around this last week was the audio recording of the children who were crying for their parents in these detention facilities. It is quite amazing how much the government has shut down any ability for journalists, for politicians even, to actually access these facilities or even know where they're at. They've really tried to do this as much as possible in secret, although at the same time, of course, the whole intention of this is to create fear as much as possible as well. You're absolutely right about that. But it's amazing, now they're setting up these tent facilities out in the desert. As somebody that lives out in the desert now myself and knows what it means to live in 110 degrees or 120 degrees, to be, living in tents in the desert for weeks on end in those kind of conditions. We're talking about horrific conditions, and it's clear that they're trying to hide this from public view.
Yes. Well, frankly, even though they are, as I said, very strongly driven by their purpose, they also know that this can be something that could potentially have negative repercussions in the field of public opinion. Although I have to say that in my opinion, they are not so careful as one may assume, just because I am convinced that part of the reason why this administration has decided to elevate this particular policy area, meaning immigration and the way immigrants are treated, to such a prominent aspect of this administration is because they believe very strongly that one of the most effective mobilizing factors when it comes to mobilizing their most loyal social electoral base is precisely this anti-immigrant campaign that this administration embraced way before anybody would assume that Donald Trump was going to become the president of the United States of America. So we have elections in November, and one of the issues that is indeed at risk in this upcoming election is the capacity of the Republican Party to retain majority in both chambers of the U.S. Congress. And so this administration, therefore, is committed, because they are convinced, that immigration can have such a powerful mobilizing effect, to actually use immigration, use inflammatory language, use what many rational people would call extremist, measures against immigrants or potential immigrants as a way of telling their base, I am delivering, I am absolutely going after these people, I am going to do whatever needs to be done to make sure they don't come in. And to me, again, it is still to be determined whether this was indeed a public relations fiasco or if it was indeed intended to be as public as it has become, simply because of who will be motivated to then go and vote Republican coming November.
Right. I want to move on to that, that topic about demonizing immigrants as being a primary goal of this administration. But before we do that, too, one last thing I want to just point out about the current situation is, today, of course, there's been the news that that Trump, under a great deal of public pressure, has signed an executive order that is basically going to change the current practice of separating families, although what all that means is, as far as we can tell at the moment at least, is that they're going to be detaining families together. So we're going to go back to the policy of detaining entire families for long periods of time in detention. So that's not, a great improvement in the situation. But I just want to point that out before we move on to the other topics.
You are absolutely correct. I mean, and people, it's ironic how an extremist regime, behaves, because they put forward something that is absolutely outrageous, something that most people, even conservatives, may find very distasteful, and then they back down to something that is also horrible, but all of a sudden it looks reasonable.
Right.
I mean, and that is just the way I have seen in my life, how dictatorial regimes tend to behave, because essentially you put the bar so high in terms of outrageousness that then when you do something that is not as outrageous, all of a sudden you seem rational.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for people by working people, and my interview with Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianza Americas, about the crisis on our southern border, where the Trump administration has been taking away the children of migrants seeking asylum. The policy is currently in flux, and it appears that moving forward, the administration's response to the public outcry against this policy will be to put whole families into detention camps. In this next part of my interview with Oscar, he talks about the dangerous and often far too successful use by the right of xenophobia to rally working-class voters, especially in the context of the coming midterm elections. On this topic of the demonization of immigrants that's gone on, and of course it was before this administration was in office too. This has been a long issue in this country. It's been building for quite a while, but certainly in the last few years of this administration, it really is disturbing. I've made it a practice, and this is something I might encourage other progressives and so on to consider doing, as I have done recently. Although it eats at your soul when you do it. But if you go to some of the more right wing media sites, whether that's Fox News or Breitbart or Drudge Report or so on, it's unbelievable that basically every single day there'll be multiple stories on these sites which try to paint migrants in the most negative possible lights. All kinds of stories of sex trafficking and violence and crime. It's clear that there is just been a endless effort to take a base that supports Trump, which already had anti-immigrant sentiments, but just drive those to an extreme.
Yes. Well, I mean, that goes to what I was just saying. I mean, and in many ways, people have short memories. But if you recall, Jerry, back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as wide segments of the U.S. working population was experiencing the pains of economic anxiety because of the fact that jobs, were leaving the U.S. in massive numbers. Ways of life, were dramatically changed because of all the changes that were introduced as early as, the mid-1980s in terms of U.S. industrial capacity going global. There was indeed a lot of anxiety, within working families in the U.S. And one location where this was real was California. And ironically, it was precisely in California where I believe for the first time in contemporary American history, you have a very dangerous combination between very openly anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant, racist discourse come into marriage with electoral politics. And we knew that, through basically the re-election campaign of Pete Wilson in 1994, which happened to be combined with a proposition, a so-called electoral, what's the name of the referendums, known as Proposition 187. That particular experience, in my view, continues to this day to play a very important role, because what the Republican Party did by basically going into bed with extremists of the likes such as Jeff Sessions or Stephen Miller today, who are top advisors in the White House of Donald Trump, this marriage, this convergence of forces in California actually turned out to be successful. The then governor, extremely troubled going into re-election, managed to secure, his re-election. And Proposition 187, which was in many ways the mother of many other anti-immigrant local initiatives that have, been adopted throughout the U.S., was actually passed. Was actually passed with the majority of votes from California voters. The problem with California was that its own demographic change dynamics was going at a speed and at a level of boldness, that was impossible to actually stop. But then look at what happened, in the 20-plus years following that particular election in 1994 in California. The whole country has gradually gone in the same way, than things played out in California in 1994, with one very important difference. The power of demographic change in the nation as a whole does not have the same characteristic that demographic changes were like in California, beginning, frankly, in the 1980s, but definitely going to where we are today, in which California basically is a minority-majority state. And what this means is that the experiment that was first put in place in California, and from where lots of lessons have been learned, is actually now playing out. But playing out in a reality where there is far more economic anxiety, especially affecting white households in states such as Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, that have actually seen their socioeconomic standard gradually become more precarious. And in absence of a good explanation, meaning more of an economic explanation as to how this happened, it's so easy to actually blame foreign nationals, for that problem. So the demonization that has taken place, what you were just mentioning a little earlier in terms of how the story of immigrants is actually presented in right-wing media outlets, takes full advantage of that underlying reality, that underlying set of factors, to essentially make the case that these are indeed the culprits, these are the people we need to guard ourselves from, they are the source of our trouble, and therefore we need to be as mean as we have to in order to contain that threat. And as it is also well known throughout history, once you successfully dehumanize, demonize a given social subject, it is very easy to attack that social subject in ways that are demeaning, that are indeed dehumanizing, and you will have a hard time finding sympathetic ears, for that particular cause. So what happened these past 2 weeks, in a way, is interesting because all of a sudden we are seeing this outpour of people upset because of what's happening. But I ask myself, will this level of upsetness remain, 2, 3, 4 weeks, 2 months from now? Simply because, as I said, the condition to which the American public opinion has been shaped into, it's basically an opinion that does not necessarily make most people be readily sympathetic, when it comes to respecting immigrants, when it comes to acknowledging that immigrants are such an important contributing factor to wealth generation in the U.S. But as I said, I really wonder if this level of anger that we have seen the last couple of weeks will still be here. 2 months down the road.
We need to take a station ID break, but when we return, we'll continue my discussion with Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianzas Americas, about Trump's policy of separating asylum seekers from their children. You're listening to Labor Express Radio, Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. Tonight's program is devoted in its entirety to an interview with Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianzas Americas, about the crisis on our southern border, where the Trump administration has been taking away the children of migrants seeking asylum. The policy is currently in flux, and it appears that moving forward, the administration's response to the public outcry against this policy will be to put whole families into detention camps. In the last part of my interview that we heard before the break, Oscar points out the often successful history in the U.S. of using xenophobia to build support among working-class voters who feel threatened by their deteriorating economic conditions, using California in the 90s as an example. It is an interesting example, as many have often argued that ultimately it was a failing strategy that doomed the Republican Party in California in later years. But as Oscar pointed out, demographic shift is a better explanation for the later failure of the Republican Party in California, and he points out that we cannot count on demographics to save us from this new national wave of xenophobia and racism. You know, that is tremendously insightful, Oscar, because to be honest, you actually changed my thinking a little bit about this issue in a way, because, you know, I used to think back to the Pete Wilson period in California as an example of how anti-immigrant politics in this country generally doesn't work in the end, because, you know, there was that period where it gained ground in California, but then it was beat back significantly in the years that followed, and it really actually undermined Pete Wilson's career in the long term, and the policies. You know, it was much like in 2006 when they put forward these, you know, really extreme anti-immigrant agenda, and that resulted in this mass uprising, and, you know, we saw kind of a movement in the other direction again. So in the past, I've always felt like, you know, when the right has tried to use this, it's backfired, because I felt that, you know, the majority of Americans generally don't share that sentiment. But I've been very worried about what I am seeing happen in recent years, where I see that, you know, that demonization is really starting to take hold in a large part of the population. So it's interesting to hear what you're saying, which is you point out that demographic shift that happened in California, which was a part of why those policies in California ultimately failed. That's not necessarily happening on the national level. Plus, you have the deepening crisis of just neoliberal economics in this country that is driving more and more people into desperation and embracing these kind of explanations for their situation.
Exactly. And again, see, I also for some time was of the opinion that the experience surrounding the 1994 election in California was actually an example of how defeat that type of effort. But the more I have seen the evolution of how demonizing immigrants, especially when you put it together in electoral politics context, I have come to be basically of a different perspective. I believe that in reality what happened in California actually has had a very powerful negative impact in the way in which immigration and immigrants have become so incredibly powerful as a factor that, used in a very carefully manipulated manner, can actually turn into successful electoral propositions. So to me, the problem that we have today, not only in the U.S., but in many countries around the world, is not just that there is a growth in anti-immigrant sentiment, a growth in white nationalism, but that embracing those two ways of thinking actually win elections. Mm-hmm. And that is what, to me, is extremely dangerous of the moment, you know, we are going through. Now, of course, I mean, if you think about the larger demographic trends in the U.S., within a matter of 40 to 50 years, the reality of the U.S. from a demographic point of view is going to be vastly different than it is today. You know, but that is, you know, a long time to wait. You know, that is a long time to expect changes to come about. I mean, many of us will already be dead, you know, when it comes to 40, 50 years from now. And so I do happen to be very concerned when I look at the actual composition of key states that are going to be decisive in the November election this year, but also the key states that are going to be decisive when it comes to the 2020 presidential elections, simply because the makeup of several of these states remains very strongly white, especially when you look at it from the perspective of voters. Who makes up, the voting age population in the 9, 10, 11 states that are actually the deciding states when it comes to the system that chooses a president in the United States of America. So again, I think that we need to go back and actually look more incisively into the meaning, of this particular very, very clever from an evil perspective, if you want, from an extremely negative perspective after all, but clever in any event, way of looking at how to mobilize voters who happen to be in many instances rightfully upset, about how their lives have changed, except that they are incapable to really see the original source of what has made their own lives change for the worse.
Right. Yeah, and I want to move into that topic too. And I'm just going to point out before we do that, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon, of course, but it's a global phenomenon.
No.
The news this week of the current deputy prime minister in Italy talking about expelling all of the Roma from Italy, or
yes.
Viktor Orban's election victory in Hungary. We're seeing this kind of xenophobia as a tool to win elections is really taking hold around the world. So it's definitely a problem. One thing that I want to move to talking about too is you point out that the source of a lot of this xenophobia stems from the real crisis in neoliberal economics around the globe. Of course, the fact that these people are fleeing Central America is also itself a result of that same crisis. And so we have to talk about, it's a little bit here about the crisis that's facing people in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. It's both an economic crisis, which has been going on for quite a long time, especially after the implementation of things like CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. It's also a political crisis. Of course, Honduras is a perfect example of this, where these recent fraudulent elections have just increased what was already a just unbelievable level of violence in that country that's forcing people to flee.
I totally agree. It's actually very ironic that the precise essential conditions, namely the way income and wealth are distributed and have been distributed over the past 30 or so years in the United States, have brought us to a moment in the history of this country in which wealth is concentrated like we have not seen in nearly a century. It was basically back in the 1920s that income inequality, wealth inequality was so overwhelmingly unfair that there were fears, that there could be a socialist revolution in the U.S. The 1929 crisis changed that perspective, at least put it on hold for a while, and that gave enough time to other people who had a more longer view of how to sustain, a capitalist system in place, to essentially embrace many of the policies that brought us, Social Security, that brought us Medicare, that brought us eventually an embracing of why unionization was good for the country. It was basically a set of measures that ensured that wealth inequality was not longer the way it was up until 1920. Even our taxation policy, was dramatically different coming out of the major financial crisis of 1929 all the way essentially through the 1970s. But that inequality, never had a process of alleviation in Central American countries, or for that matter in Mexico. The inequality was equally bad, back then in Central American countries, in Mexico, and it remained so for a long time. Remember that it was precisely that deep inequality often associated, with oligarchies in power in Central America, that made possible for revolutionary movements to gain so much traction in the 1970s and 80s. Those revolutions, were vastly not successful, with the exception of Nicaragua in Central America, and I'm not talking about Cuba because that's kind of a separate topic in any event, but in Central America, inequality never went through a process of social compensation, as it was the case, in the U.S. So what we have today is a situation where there still is profound inequality in Central American countries that has only been alleviated because of the billions and billions of dollars that are sent by family members working in the U.S. to their loved ones in Central America, and for that matter, Mexico as well. If those people had not left, their countries of origin and had not been sending money the way they have, you can rest assured that there would be a far more critical situation from a poverty standpoint in those countries. But as if that were not enough, reasons for people to want to go someplace else where they can possibly get 4, 5, 10 times more wages than they could by breaking their back equally hard in their own countries if they successfully manage to move to the U.S. But on top of that, we have a situation of growing violence, growing insecurity, to the point in which several of these countries in Central America have actually become famous because of the fact that they have now become the most violent places when it comes to numbers of homicides per year outside from openly at war nations. And so the combination of all these factors is precisely, what makes so heartbreaking for a mother or a father who are fully aware about the dangers that they will face if they try to get to the U.S. without visas with their children. They don't ignore the dangers. They know the dangers. But those dangers seem smaller to the dangers that they face if they stay. Mm-hmm. And that is the part that I find very much missing from most of the news coverage that we have seen over the past couple of weeks. But this is something that we also saw back in 2014. We continue to miss the background to all this, which is conditions of life that are increasingly impossible. That is what makes so many parents, so many mothers make the painful decision to depart and engage in a trip that is dangerous. You can even lose your life in such a trip. But they consider that that's a lesser evil than staying in their own countries.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for people by working people. Tonight's program is devoted in its entirety to an interview with Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianza Americas. As Oscar explained in the previous segment, it is the economic and political foreign policy of the United States that is in large part to blame for the desperate condition of the working class in Central America and the rise in violence there. Honduras is a perfect case in point where the military coup government there recently blocked an electoral victory by reformers with the full support of the U.S. government, plunging the nation into an even deeper round of repressive violence by the state. Now the Trump administration is talking about taxing or otherwise interfering with the remittances or money sent back home by Central American migrants in this country, which threatens the only remaining economic lifeline that many subsist on in Central America, which will lead to only greater violence, desperation, and, of course, increased migration.
It's absolutely infuriating to hear constantly by politicians in this country and much of the media as well that if these countries are in crisis, that the people should stay in their own countries and change the situation there rather than come here. When the reason those countries are in crisis is basically, by and large, a result of decades of U.S. policy, both economic in terms of pushing neoliberal economic agendas, pushing free trade agreements, and also political in terms of supporting repressive regimes like the current one in Honduras. They're the ones creating these crises to begin with. And then, as you point out, out, this crackdown too on that the administration has threatened on remittances and so on from immigrants sent here will only create an even more devastating situation in Central America.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what makes it also heartbreaking, because the policy approach in the U.S. is one that emphasizes, above all, punishment. It emphasizes restriction. It emphasizes exclusion. And that's the only way that policymakers, and in this respect I have to say it's not just the Republican Party, because let's remember that who was going to ever predict that precisely Barack Obama would become, the top executive in the U.S. who would deport the most people in history.
Right.
And that was something that was hard for a lot of people to hear, hard for a lot of people to understand, but it is real. This approach, which basically came into place in the very late 1990s, it's a policy that was originally brought in, indeed, by Republican Party leaders, and that it was actually, how could I put it, fully institutionalized with the passage of the 1996 immigration policy change, adopted in September of that year, but that soon becomes, the way the Democratic Party also embraces, the idea of how to manage, migration. So I always say, that we honestly have not had any truly alternative, any truly asymmetrical, antithetical, if you want, policy position when it comes to how to manage human mobility in the current era of globalization. And certainly not a policy proposition that is grounded on the idea that human beings have rights just because of the fact that they are human beings.
You're absolutely right, and that's a much bigger discussion that we need to absolutely have, and I'm going to definitely invite you to come back in a future program to go into that in more detail, that kind of macro level of the need to address the human rights to migration, really. But we don't have time to go into that now. But what I do want to go into before we end our conversation is how immigrant communities are fighting back. I know that there is plans for a June 30th demonstrations all over the country. And the big one's planned for D.C., but there's ones planned for all over the country. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also other ways that immigrant communities and their allies are fighting back?
Well, first of all, let me say that immigrant communities, particularly Latin American immigrant communities, beginning with the Mexican immigrant community, as you may have noticed, have been significantly absent in terms of the way that English media has been covering the issues of the past couple of weeks. And that is the result, or simply a symptom, of a problem that continues to be true today, as it was true, for most of the past 15, 20 years, which is that immigrants themselves, even when we organize ourselves, are not necessarily organized at the level of some of the dominant, mainly DC-centric organizations that tend to still be the organizations English media tend to go to know what's going on, to be basically asking them, why this is happening. Immigrant community leaders do not necessarily play the primary role of spokespeople for moments as sad as they are, like the ones we've been seeing the last couple of weeks. But with that said, I think that there is indeed a very strong level of anger that is being channeled into a nationally coordinated set of events for June 30th. As you pointed out, there will be, many demonstrations, including the one in Washington, D.C., but there will also be, I would dare to say, in every major city, mobilizations. And the reason these mobilizations are happening is because there are a lot of people with different interests, different reasons for why to engage in high-level mobilization on June 30th, taking part. I cannot ignore the fact that for a lot of Democrats that have been trying to find an angle to attack, the Trump administration, especially as we enter the summer, which is the last stretch in the November midterm elections of this year. This is seen as an opportunity to potentially create, precisely an opening that may allow for a more defined way of characterizing the choice that people will face in November. I mean, do you want to bring or to continue to keep in power people who embrace the notion of dividing children from their mom, their dad, and putting them through the kind of pain that has actually been now recorded? Or do you want people who are not inclined to do that, even though they may not necessarily say what they would do, as an alternative to that particular approach? So, again, the good thing is there is momentum. There is a lot of people interested in mobilizing, interested in basically showing how angry they are with the latest moves of this administration. And we are, at Alianza Americas, definitely encouraging people at the local level to participate every way they can in these mobilizations. I think that there are also other less known ways, of people to actually make their disagreement to these policies be known, including actions of civil disobedience, actions of actually exposing leaders in the Trump administration that on one side of their mouth want to say that they care about human rights, but on the other side of their mouth, are the first to say put them all in detention. And so, again, I think that we have entered a summer into 2018 that will probably be somewhat similar, to what happened, as you may recall, in the spring of 2016, when we saw those huge mobilizations that took place. And I think that the big challenge is going to be how to make sure that these mobilizations against these harsh measures taken by this administration are also combined with addressing the many other factors that are making so many people in the U.S. feel insecure, feel that their future is unknown, because in the end it boils down to the kind of economic policies that have been dominant for the past 2-3 decades that we all need to challenge in conjunction, with challenging the tendency to become more xenophobic, more racist, and ready to embrace white nationalist solutions, which are absolutely no solutions.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up the point that far too often migrant communities are not allowed to speak for themselves, and that's why I always reach out to Alianza Americas about these issues, so that as an immigrant-led organization, you guys can always speak to this in a way that nobody else can. So I really appreciate that. One last thing I want to say before I go, too, on the side of organized labor in this, there was an interesting story that came out today about American Airlines was being used to fly, I guess, these children at different locations around the country. As they're being separated, they were sending them to different detention centers, and American Airlines was being used for that purpose. Apparently, they weren't telling American Airlines that that's what they were doing, and they kind of found out that's what was going on. And the good thing is that the company actually said that they will no longer participate in these activities. But the first thought that came to my mind is, every union at American Airlines, the pilots, the flight attendants, the mechanics, should immediately, in a situation like that, adamantly refuse to participate in that situation. The unions have to take much bolder positions than they have before. They've been great at, turning out for rallies. They've been great at helping to organize, know your rights workshops and those kind of things. But we have to take a much bolder stand in the face of what's going on now as organized labor, because there is no way that organized labor can succeed and can grow and can become more powerful if immigrants' rights aren't a part of that agenda. And we have to start demanding that the unions take much more bold action to stand up for immigrants than what they've done so far.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that labor unions, have played an important role, are playing an important role, but can play an even stronger role if they are able to not only stand on on a principled position when it comes to immigrants and immigration, but also making the leap, to understand that an issue like human mobility in the world today can only be properly addressed in a way that is humane and in a way that makes us all proud, if we understand that in the end it's all about changing the very economic policies that are now in place so that we can once again work towards an economic system that is far more equitable, far more sustainable, much more willing to understand that social investment, as it is in the case of public education, access to health care, decent housing, are all policies that actually make us strong, not only in the U.S., but make us strong also in countries like Mexico or Central American nations. Only when we succeed in making countries like those from where so many people are coming from today, places where people want to stay and even perhaps return to, we will actually find a healthy equilibrium in terms of migration.
Absolutely, and the labor movement needs to take the offensive on these issues. I mean, it's not like there aren't examples out there in Europe. Many times, working people and their organizations have blocked deportations of people, have advocated, have taken civil disobedience actions to prevent the government from cracking down on migrants. And there's been all kinds of other examples of how working people can pursue the kind of economic agenda you're discussing. In future programs of this program, we're going to be talking about things like shortening the working day, which workers in Germany have recently won. There's all kinds of things that we need to really start talking about in emboldening the labor in this country to really push forward an agenda that can push back on the crisis that we're facing that's leading to this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Oscar, for taking this time to talk with me. I really appreciate it, and we'll definitely, on our website, put up all the information I can about the June 30th demos and any other demonstrations that will be coming up that people can get involved in.
That sounds great, Jerry. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You can find out more details of the planned demonstrations happening in Chicago, in D.C., and around the country on the 30th by going to the Labor Express Radio Facebook page at facebook.laborexpress.org, facebook.laborexpress.org. I'll continue to post updates there about how we can all fight back against this administration's xenophobic policies, so make sure to check out our Facebook page frequently for updates. One topic I had hoped to discuss with Oscar in our interview, but we ran out of time, is how the current separation of families is reminiscent of a long history of tearing apart the families of people of color and the poor in this country, as happened during slavery, during the forced removal of Native American children from their families to send them to government boarding schools in the late 19th and early 20th century, and also during that same period, the removal of the children of immigrants from Southern and Eastern European backgrounds who were deemed unfit to raise their own children because of their poverty. This has definitely got a long history in this country. I'll be posting articles on this topic up on our Facebook page. So again, check facebook.laborexpress.org, facebook.laborexpress.org for more on this. That's all for tonight's program. Labor Express is a nonprofit 501c3 member of IBEW Local 1220. Views expressed on Labor Express are those that's produced and not necessarily those IBEW. Labor Express is a production of the Community for Labor Access in Chicago, the world capital of the labor movement. The song used in our theme is called Worker Songs, written by Ed Pickford and recorded by the Dropkick Murphys. Tune in next Sunday at 8 p.m. for another edition of Labor Express.